Hey guys, for today's podcast, I sit down with Robyn Gobbel. Robyn Gobbel, she's a licensed social worker. She's a psychotherapist turned speaker, trainer, writer. She formerly was the founder of the Central Texas Attachment and Trauma Center. And now she lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she's doing more of training helpers and people in the industry rather than her clinical practice with clients. But she has 15 years of experience being a therapist to kids and families who are dealing with trauma. Now, Robyn has posted a lot about this human-informed versus trauma-informed, meaning that it's really just how the human's brain works and how we should really come to every child in a particular way rather than saying like, oh, it's bio kids versus trauma kids, and this is how I come at my bio kids, and this is how I come at my trauma kids. And so I was like, okay, I love this. I can jump on that. But then as I would read it, like in my own head, I'd be like, okay, but there are definite things that I would do with my bio kid that I wouldn't do with a kid that I was going to foster or adopt or had a significant trauma history. So I really wanted to ask her about this because I wanted to know, like, am I coming at this in a wrong way? And she really gives me a lot of clarity around this, what human focused means, and really stopping using this label of trauma kids, which you'll see the kids themselves don't really like to be labeled that. So I do think that there's, still a space for people to learn about trauma and being trauma informed. Specifically, if you're going to be a foster parent or an adoptive parent, you do need to learn about how trauma impacts the brain. But we don't need to go so far as to separate these two so much that there's trauma kids and there's normal kids, and this is how you parent them separately. So she really opened my eyes. I asked her some tough questions, and I was vulnerable enough to tell her my thoughts, which might have been, wrong or maybe possibly doing them the wrong way, but she gave me some really good insight, and I think that it will be helpful for you guys. So without further ado, here we go. Hi, I'm Rebecca Britt, and this is the Stable Moments Podcast, the show where we discuss all things related to the foster care system and early childhood trauma, from foster parents, trauma experts, former foster kids, and beyond. We'll take a deep dive into the complexities of the foster care crisis in an effort to better understand how to fix it. You could just tell everyone who you are and how you got into the therapy work you do.
Okay. Yeah, so I am a licensed clinical social worker, so I'm a psychotherapist. And since I went into practice 15 years ago, I've always worked with kids with complex trauma and their families, mostly exclusively, though, in the last 5 years, I started to do a lot more work with adults, oftentimes with similar histories as well.
So how did you get into serving this specific population?
Well, I always wanted to work with kids who had been really hurt. Now I would use the word complex trauma. Back, 20 years ago, that's not the words we would have used. But that's always, since being in high school, that's just where I've always been drawn professionally. So when I finished my master's in social work degree at age 24, I've always worked with kids with trauma histories. Yeah.
So over the years that you've worked in this industry, how have you learned about, because I know a lot of this stuff is rather new. Like we're starting to now really hear like trauma informed all over the place, and they're doing trauma trainings for police officers and trauma trainings for social workers, but we still meet social workers that aren't trauma informed or don't know just the very basics. So how has that changed in your work over time?
Yeah. I think part of it for me has been a combination of luck and tenacity. Like Austin, Texas, where I've lived for the past 15 years, was a really great place to be a therapist. It's progressive, it's curious. Community members are interested in new information. So there was a lot. I didn't feel alone in Austin, Texas, in being curious about trauma, being curious about attachment. It's grown. When I first started, all those 15-ish years ago, there weren't certainly near as many people. And that was part of my objective when I was there, was we've got to build this community stronger. But it wasn't difficult to build a community like it is in some places in the country where there's, just not as much resources or knowledge or information. And about the impact of trauma. So in a way, I kind of got lucky to land in Austin, Texas. And then I've also been just really tenacious about always finding mentors who aligned with what I wanted. Like I've always known what I wanted, what I believed, and I sought out those mentors and, asked them to mentor me, and almost always I got lucky and they said yes.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's great. And good mentorship is really priceless, because
absolutely.
I know that when I first started working as a social worker, I could have gone to so many different places. I would have gone to anybody that was going to hire me in a recession. And the fact
Yep.
that I ended up where I did, I
Yeah.
know I'm so lucky, because really I should have paid for that education more than even my, undergrad.
Right, our degrees.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
So in 15 years of being a therapist, first of all, where did your referrals come from mainly? Did they come directly from Department of Children and Families, or was it, self-referral?
So at first, just because of the way things work in Texas, which is not the same way in every state, my referral base mainly came from being a Medicaid provider, because children adopted out of foster care in the state of Texas, most of them are given Medicaid as a benefit until they're 18.
Mm-hmm.
So the need was so great that really all I needed to do was to become a Medicaid provider and let adoption agencies in the area know, or post-adoption services know, who I was, and was able to develop a pretty full practice really quickly, just because there weren't a lot of people really claiming that as their area of expertise. And then as the years went along, just it really grew a very strong community in Austin, which then started to become its just own referral source.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Yeah.
And was the modality, was it basically face-to-face talk therapy? What did you use? Was it family unit? Was it individual?
Mm-hmm. I've always worked through the lens of family treatment when possible. So I, had a pretty traditional outpatient practice of, which is not what I necessarily think is the best, way to do treatment with this population, but sometimes we just got to do what we have available to us. So I was a pretty traditional outpatient therapist and saw clients an hour a week, almost always seeing kids and families together as a unit. I mean, that's my paradigm, and that's also the primary way I've been trained, is to do parent-child dyadic therapy together.
Okay. And
Yeah.
with the parents, when the parents were with you, are you talking bio, foster, adoptive, or all of the above?
Well, because of the practice that I had, I probably was always 75 to 80% adoptive families.
Okay.
So I had kids and their adoptive parents in the office. Not always. I worked with some biological families too, but almost exclusively was adoptive families.
Okay. So you really had the opportunity to work on building
Mm-hmm.
attachment
Yep.
and going back through kind of that trauma and helping them get their developmental needs met and all of that.
Yeah, if people wanted to work with me, they knew that that was what the kind of therapy that I was offering. And so that was something we would talk about right up front, that I was, an attachment-based therapist. I did lots of family work and family involvement so that the potential client could have the opportunity to choose, is this the kind of therapy that I want?
And how long did the typical family stay with you?
Well, I mean, that just varies so much. Kids with complex trauma typically need a lot of therapy. And so, if I was really going to be able to do like a course of treatment from beginning to end, it could be 18 months to 3 years or more, even
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. The therapist that I absolutely loved and partnered with on most of my cases, I don't think that there was an end date that she
Yeah.
was thinking of,
Yeah.
and I think the parents needed it as much. And a lot of her sessions were like kid alone, parents alone, all three together, or so that it was like marriage therapy. It was everything,
Yeah.
because it was a lot.
Yeah, well, without a doubt, these families were struggling so intensely and we're getting so much relief out of coming to therapy that I became, a really important part of their support system, just even as a family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, sometimes I'd see a kid in a family for a really long time. And sometimes I'd see a family for, a year and a half and we'd discharge and then they'd come back a year or two later, which is very common when you work with kids in general, but then kids with trauma histories as they go through new developmental milestones, it's really common to need, kind of a booster shot of
Yeah,
therapy. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you see many kids that were therapied out by the time they came to you? Like they already knew clinical language, they were overseeing therapists. Because in my line of work, like with the equine therapies, I know that that's one thing that's kind of nice, is that it's an alternative
Yeah.
where parents would come to me and be like, the last time we tried to go to a therapist, my daughter tried to jump out of the car, so
Yeah.
we need to go to
Yep.
the barn
Yeah.
instead. And don't mention the word, like she's just hanging out
Yeah.
with horses.
Yeah. Yeah. No therapy words.
Right.
Yeah, definitely some of that, when you become more of a kind of a specialist, you tend to get clients that are higher acuity.
Mm.
And so it wasn't uncommon for me to see kids who had attempted a lot of previous therapy. Um, that said, as my career has gone on, I have really worked more and more with younger children.
Mm.
So, not that younger kids don't get therapied out, but it just looks a little bit different when their experience in therapy is different than a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that they protest going to therapy looks different.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I didn't have it quite as much, but I think that's mostly just because of my population. I just worked with younger kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, in your 15 years as a therapist, what have been your biggest learning experiences? Like, can you think of times that you were just like, they will just never leave you for your career, and they really set set the course for how you practiced in the future?
Well, I would say probably like the thing that instantly jumps to mind for me is when I was introduced to the theory of interpersonal neurobiology, which is Dan Siegel's work, and then how that's progressed into kind of a bigger field that a lot of people are calling the relational neurosciences.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a really clear memory of where I was when I first learned about who Dan Siegel was, and then went and got some of his audios and started just listening to things voraciously and feeling so in alignment to everything he was saying, like, oh, like this is what I've been looking for. This interpersonal neurobiology is not a clinical theory or a clinical modality specifically. It's really more a theory of just being human.
Mm.
And it felt so honoring. It felt so hopeful. And I think especially when working with kids with such significant complex trauma that other clinicians, especially, 10-ish years ago, would have really labeled reactive attachment disorder. There's just so much going into what people thought about that diagnosis and thought about what the appropriate way to treat them clinically and the appropriate way to parent them was, that often involved a lot of controlling and punitive and harsh tactics, and really held this view of them as almost that they kind of needed to be broken of their controlling behavior and the manipulation, and that always felt awful to me. That was never the way that I practiced, but it was always sort of there looming, especially with other colleagues. So really finding a theory that helped me understand like how the relational and social brain develops, and then what happens when doesn't have the opportunity to develop in optimal conditions or optimal environment. And that really, I think, set my career and my work and even just who I am as a person on a very new path.
So what did your work look like before? Like, what principles were you working off of before that, and how did it change?
So I think in a way I wasn't entirely sure what principles I was working off of. I had a lot of techniques and tools, and I was trained in EMDR, and I was trained in play therapy. I was trained in a lot of these interventions. I was also a younger therapist, and so this is a pretty normal clinical trajectory too, to have a lot of tools and techniques but not be exactly sure why you're using them, right? And so I landing on, again, what was beyond a clinical theory, it was a real theory of human development, allowed me to feel so much more confident than in what I was doing in the room, and the tools and techniques that I was doing and the treatment planning I was doing, so that I didn't have to be so rigid with a specific training or a specific technique, right? Like I could use what I understood about how the social brain develops and how it heals, which then I think the primary shift for me is that it allows you to be so much more present with your clients, right? When you're not always thinking what do I do next? What's the next step? How do I fix this behavior? Right? Yeah.
And just so how does Dan Siegel's perspective differ from Karen Purvis or Dan Hughes or Bruce Perry? I know Bruce Perry's done a lot of the neurofeedback and the brain mapping and focused on development. So has everyone I know that's been in the trauma space.
Sure. So I would say all the people that you just listed would fit squarely into what's expanded beyond interpersonal neurobiology and into the relational neurosciences field.
Okay.
So Dan Hughes's work is at this time, in 2020, now that the science is all available, is absolutely, from all I can tell, I've actually never had the luxury of training with Dan Hughes directly, is, real solidly based in interpersonal neurobiology and the relational neurosciences too, as is Perry's neurosequential model, is another component of really understanding from a holistic way, again, how humans develop and then what happens when they don't have the opportunities to develop optimally, which is of course all Bruce Perry's work is about.
How do you, so I love how you just said, it gives you this foundation of rather than fixing. Which is one of my biggest learning experiences as well. I remember my supervisor telling me once, listen, we don't give you a magic wand. Like social work doesn't come with like this, like you get to pick. Like what you do get to do is be in the thick
Yeah.
of it with people and show them
Yeah.
that like, I'm going to be in the thick of it with you. And that was actually really relieving to me, because like the truth is
Yes.
there aren't answers possibly, or maybe
Right.
you will be sitting across, your kid in a prison, visitation room. And what I'll do is
Right.
help you handle that in a way that
Right.
is non-shaming for him and okay for you, and that you can live with that. But it's not like
Right.
we're going to change exactly what life looks like, because we'll inevitably be
Right.
disappointed. So I love
Right.
that. I love that. Now, so if you start to realize, okay, this is all developmental stuff that the kid missed out on, and we need to go back and kind of heal these parts of the brain that missed out of developmental milestones, how do you deal with the parents that bring their own stuff? Like I'm sure you've had parents that are in there and
Yeah.
they can't wrap their head around this trauma informed lens as
Yeah.
as you can.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I do is to remember that everything I know about the brain and that I'm applying to the children's brain applies directly to adult brains too. And so when adults come into the office and they're rigid, or sometimes combative, or verbally, or not very open to new information, really harsh and critical about their kid, what I know is that that's a person whose brain is also in a state of trauma.
Mm.
And so that's my first step, because that allows me to stay like non-defensive and in a place of compassion for them, while still setting a boundary about like, this is how I work and this is what I believe about kids and families. And so if you want to work with me, this is what part of that's going to look like, while staying, as much as humanly possible. I'm human too, and it happens to the best of us.
Sure.
But as much as humanly possible, staying out of judgment, staying in compassion, and again, believing the same thing about them that I believe about their kids, that when their brain is, when they're feeling regulated, when they're feeling connected, when they're feeling safe, when they're not faced with kind of chronic chaos, chronic dysregulation, in this chronic state of fight flight, they're going to open up and experience things the same way that I'm experiencing them. Like, it's not going to be an argument anymore, because it makes sense when your brain's not flooded with fight flight. The things that I teach parents make sense to them.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
So what's your biggest advice if you were like, I'm going to hand out this one piece of advice for all parents? What would the one thing be?
Whoa. That, as hard as it is, always, and I'm a parent too, the number one thing we have to do when we're faced with a behavioral challenge with our kid is to pause and see what's happening for us. Because we can't, unless, and also I'll say parents, unless there's a legit emergency, like, we need to call 911 emergency, because things are actually dangerous. And sometimes that absolutely happens with these kids and with their families, that there's a very legit emergency. But if there is not an actual legit emergency happening right now, the most important thing always to do is to pause, breathe, connect with yourself, because we'll never do anything with a kid who is, in the total dysregulation if we just jump in and join their dysregulation.
I love it. So one thing I wanted to ask you about was, can therapeutic parenting be overdone? And this is rooted in, so I used to give parents advice, trauma-informed advice and techniques. And then I would go back like a week later and they would be like, we've done everything that you've said. And like, it was an over, so like I would give them a technique that was like, label his feelings for him, like tell him like, hey bud, like I know this is tough for you. And so then I would go back and the kid would be like throwing pepperoni at their face. And they're like, this is tough for you. And like it was just so obvious that some boundaries and some structure was need to be put up. But like the kid was completely dysregulated. And it was like, they kept, talking about, you're running hot right now. Your energy is very high. And I'm like, oh gosh. And I was the one that told you to like label it. And now we are like over labeling everything. And it's triggering me.
Bless them for trying.
I know.
Right. Well, so you're not describing therapeutic parenting. You're describing very permissive parenting.
Okay.
So, and I don't really even love to call it therapeutic parenting because I think it's just like human-based parenting, like everything we know now about how people work and how kids work and how regulation develops and the attachment cycle. I don't even necessarily think it's therapeutic or trauma informed. It just is. So, but you're also just, most of us are either really good at the like nurture side of parenting. We're really good at like welcoming our kids in when they're stressed and they need regulation and, oh baby, how can I help you? Or we're better at structure and kind of pushing the baby bird out of the proverbial nest. Like almost all of us lean more one way or the other. And if we're just leaning a little bit more one way or the other, no problem. Things are going to be fine. But some parents can really lean all to like nurture. And again, then that doesn't look therapeutic, that looks permissive. Or they lean to structure. And then that ends up looking harsh and punitive because they don't have any other skills to kind of lean back on. But you're also describing a very common trajectory for parents who are trying new ways of parenting, as if their pendulum swings really far the other way first, and so they they get these new ideas and they new skills and they're like, okay, I need to label feelings more. I need to be more empathic, more on the nurture side of things. And then all of a sudden, like all the structure like goes out the window. Or the opposite happens, really nurturing family gets good, they go all the way, to the structure side and they lose some of the nurture. And so what I learned over the years was kind of to prep families for that, but also kind of soothe myself that this is a process. It takes more than a week for a family to, revamp how they're parenting. And they are going to have like these major pendulum swings before kind of finding their middle ground that works in their family.
Yeah. I've noticed that some of the most rewarding cases for me have been, they're usually adoptive parents that are like, oh my gosh, I know this kid's trauma history. Like, I just want to, it's really difficult for me to tell him no, or to not just hold him, or to, separate from him, or say like, mommy has to go now because like, oh my gosh, he's sitting there saying like, mommy, please don't leave. And then like, I feel like I'm abandoning him. And so I'm just going to, and I'm like, this isn't healthy for him to be so connected to you. I don't want to use the word connected, but it's like overly attached, to have this anxious attachment to you. But in those times, being able to show them like, we're going to have you separate from him, and we're going to keep you connected by a piece of yarn, or however we do keep you connected. But I'm going to show you that he can exist without you, and show him he can exist, and show you can exist. But usually it comes from this place of like, I just don't want to add to anything that has already happened. So it comes from this place of like really trying to be the best parent. And they've read all these like trauma-informed perspectives,
Well, I really believe in my heart that all parents are trying to be their best parent possible with those tools that they have available. And some parents are more able to regulate through their child's dysregulation than others. For some parents, their child's dysregulation is too hard for them. And so they lower the bar of expectations for their kids too much. And so working with those families to find the sweet spot of like, where's the bar for your child's kind of discomfort that they can tolerate, because it doesn't do us any good to kind of like rip the proverbial rug out from underneath them either.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got to be constantly kind of reassessing, not even just developmentally, but sometimes day to day or moment to moment, right? Like sometimes my kid has more capacity to tolerate stress than other days due to a whole lot of circumstances.
Sure.
And really learning your kid and being attuned to your kid to know, like, is this a situation that's uncomfortable to them, but they will be okay, versus is this situation just too much for them? And my job right now is to, protect them from that. Um,
So
and just constantly reassessing that.
yeah, I like how you say that, because when I've seen your stuff about human
Mm-hmm.
informed versus trauma
Mm-hmm.
informed, I've like, I'm like, okay, yeah, I get that. And then I'm like, oh, but like, I do feel like there are things that I would do with my bio kid that I
Mm-hmm.
might not do with a kid that has endured trauma, because I just know, like, dude, you're safe and you're connected and you
Yeah.
have a secure attachment, and like, sorry.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I don't think I hear what you're saying totally, but I also don't think it has to do with, bio kid, trauma kid. It has to do with, as a parent, attuning to where their bar is,
mm,
where their tolerance level is. And that kids with trauma histories have a much, much, much narrower window of stress tolerance. And so as a parent or a caregiver or a teacher, I absolutely want to take that into consideration. But the difference isn't necessarily the type of parenting technique, for example, that I would use. The difference is, where's my bar for my kids' behavior? Like, I'm not going to hit either of them, regardless of whether they're a kid who's experienced trauma or not experienced trauma, right? That's, for me, that's just that kind of falls into, that's not about being trauma informed.
mm-hmm,
That's just about understanding how humans work.
mm-hmm,
And when we hurt them, they work actually less well
sure.
than more well. And so it's then comes down to, where's the bar? Like, what can I expect from this kid, and how much co-regulation do they need from me? That's almost always what it is. My 16-year-old with a trauma history needs significantly more co-regulation from me than my 16-year-old who doesn't have a trauma history. And so maybe that looks like increased boundaries. Maybe that looks like lower expectations with regards to like chores. You could look like a whole lot of different things, but to me, that's less about the specifics of their trauma and more about being attuned to what this individual needs, and always believing that they're doing the very best that they can.
I love that. I love that. And
Yeah.
I'm learning more and more about how individualized
Yeah.
everyone's treatment needs to be. And I
Yeah.
really thought that I knew that. But
Yeah.
then as I go out and I train people on this, whatever, I'm like, I feel like I'm actually learning that I'm like putting more of a blanket, like, this is what trauma kids are.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I don't really love that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and one example, which like plays in my head, that I'm always like, I wonder what that's about, is I have a cousin that was adopted. He was diagnosed reactive attachment disorder. And really what worked for him, and I feel like, was just completely added to him being a successful member of society,
Mm-hmm.
was military school. And now he's a
Mm-hmm.
Marine, but like was not doing successful in like a typical public school or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
something about the structure of like, listen, I know exactly what gets me on the like you're doing good list, like needing that clear structure was what he needed. Something that I would be like, do not send that kid to military school. You know what I mean? Like, I would be like, oh my gosh, like, spend some time, like, rock that kid, love that kid. But like, he has a profound sense of purpose being a Marine today. So that's just really interesting to me, because that's, I mean, I don't know, who knows, maybe had his parents had more tools in their toolbox and were able to go through this whole really therapeutic, like, process with him.
Yeah. It's impossible to know, but I do absolutely, like, some people for a wide variety of reasons do better in different kind of settings than even like the structure that's afforded of a typical family setting. For me, the difference comes down to, I think 10 years ago, the therapeutic community, when they spoke about those kinds of children, spoke about them pretty harshly and pretty negatively. Where for me, it's just it's a paradigm shift of understanding that's what they need. And we want to be careful, like, not all military environments are certainly going to provide the level of felt safety that kids with trauma histories need, but certainly many can. And I've also seen that, like, when we really, really increase the structure, but what do we also do? We're increasing co-regulation. We're like, all the rules, all the never aloneness, right? Like, all the expectations, like, there's so much that's going into that's increasing the structure, increasing co-regulation, increasing a sense of belonging and connection to the people that they're with, like this shared sense of purpose. So yeah, there's all sorts of things that could go into why that could be really helpful for somebody, depending on how the trauma had impacted their particular nervous system.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I love to continue learning and to not, I feel a big sense of responsibility, if I'm going to speak on the matter at all, to keep learning and to not put some, like, blanket statements out there that a kid or any human would be like, that's not me. Like, you're not representing us well.
Yeah. And we're hearing that, children who have grown into adults now and have their voice has power. They are saying, they don't like being labeled trauma kids. They don't like being pigeonholed into this being the totality of their being. They want to be recognized as human beings with complex needs, like everyone else.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago, I did an interview with a woman that had been adopted out of foster care, and she was like, she's, looks very well to do, like in a nice affluent suburb of Atlanta. And she's like, when I say, like, I was adopted out of foster care, people are like, oh, like, as soon as she says that, it like puts her in a different category, and they're like, oh, well, you must have had great parents because you obviously turned out great. Like, people don't know how to react to that.
Right.
Yeah. So I know that you've transitioned to training professionals. What's your main messages for professionals? Like, what do you love to train on, and what do you want them to know?
I have a couple main things right now. One is I do a lot of training with therapists who work with kids on using, like, movements, rhythm, sensory play in the therapy room. So really bringing the body and regulation through the body, and also really listening to and being attuned to and aware of the body's story and the story that's being told through the body. So that's my favorite thing to teach that looks like a technique or a tool. I really love to work with therapists and helpers, healers, on understanding that really the most important thing that they do has absolutely nothing to do with a tool. And it has to do with really continuing to do their own really hard work so that their nervous system can be as, like, open and resonant and available. And then when they when they do become triggered by clients, which is inevitable, it's not possible not to, have stuff and kind of awoken in us with our clients, that we can notice it, have compassion for ourselves, and then think about, okay, what does that mean? Like, why did that happen? And what can I do with that information therapeutically? So those are really my two main loves clinically right now. And then I also have been just trying to do more and more speaking and writing and building awareness on kind of the neurobiology of being human and the neurobiology of connection just in general, that what we understand now about the autonomic nervous system and what we understand about like behaviors being such a teeny, teeny, tiny piece of what's happening for us neurobiologically, yet it's what we are judging everybody on is their behavior. And, I feel like if the whole world could understand like Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory and how he asserts that connection's a biological imperative. Every single one of us is always, always, always looking for connection. So if I'm in a relationship with somebody who is not acting as though they're really very interested in connection, can I be curious about that instead of judgmental or character assassination? And then depending on my role, if I'm a teacher or I'm a parent or I'm a coach, what can I do knowing that connection is a biological imperative? What can I do to support this child so that they can kind of be their best selves? Instead of this self that everybody's frustrated with.
I love that because like one thing you said was you would tell helpers or people in this space that the main thing they need to focus on is themselves and doing their own work.
Yeah.
And I know that I've been there myself where I'm like, I'm supposed to be this like social worker. I'm supposed to be this person that like, in fact, one of my like top strengths when I did like the strengths finder or whatever, and that is connection. And a lot of times I'll be like, I don't want to connect. Like I am like head down to my like, don't want to talk to my neighbors. Like there's a lot of times when I feel like connection's the last thing I want when it's my first strength. So it's just funny that like you said, like, no judgment when you notice there's somebody that doesn't want to connect and all of that. And I would agree too that no judgment when you don't want to connect.
Exactly. Yeah. The self-compassion, curious, like, being connected out, especially for those of us who err more towards introversion, which is not myself. I'm actually quite extroverted, is not the same as the feeling of connection not being safe. So there's a big difference between wanting to kind of retreat and regroup and just like, sensory, like I just need everybody to go away.
Yeah.
Than the feeling of connection isn't safe or it's dangerous and I'm behaving in a way that's actively pushing connection away, as opposed to what I heard you describe is maybe a little bit of just like fatigue from having, doing really hard jobs, but also making sure that part of who we connect with is ourselves, and so.
No, it's a huge part. It's like the number one part. And that's like, I work with a spiritual intuitive woman that always says like, as you work on your stuff, it frees everyone else to work on their stuff.
Yeah.
And things fall into place. And really, if everybody just did their own work, we would all be able to connect better. And it's all an inside job. Like everything that you're having issues with externally, even those things when I'm like, oh, people don't come out. It's not like the people, obviously. It's all an inside job.
Right. Although I will say, for me, it is an inside job and I have to do my own work, but I want to do that work with somebody else because of the way our brains are, changing and blossoming, we'll say, in connection with other people through the resonant circuitry with someone else. So I'm not saying, it's time alone, you know, self work that's done by ourselves. There's a huge place for that. It's very important, but it's also important to have a place where we have somebody who, again, is non-judgmental, accepting, boundaried, and having, you know, a connected, co-regulated relationship with another human. Both are really important.
Yeah, I get that. And when we talk about kids, you know,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to be like, my husband's a teacher, you know, and comes home with all sorts of stories, but you know, he's not going to be like, it's an inside job, Tommy, you know,
Yeah,
and be
yeah,
like, if you could do your work, you know.
yeah,
So that
yeah,
would be more his responsibility to do his work if he was frustrated in that moment. But you're right, to
yeah,
offer that kid as a teacher, or
yeah,
to offer that kid safe connection.
yeah.
So if you feel like, so how do we put connection and safety attachment first
Mm-hmm.
while fostering independence? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so if I was a teacher or a social worker or whatever, and I was like, okay, I need to create a space that a kid feels safe. I need to know
Right,
that they feel connected. They need to feel not judged. If
right.
you feel like you have provided that,
Mm-hmm.
like, how do you know the line of like, now I'm going to encourage or push this kid to like step up to the plate, or, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's mostly trial and error. That um, it's a lot. If we pull it back into what it looks like to like parent a baby, right? Like it's a lot of, I'll take care of you, I'll take care of you, I'll take care of you. I have no expectations for you at all, no expectations for you at all. As soon as you need me, I'll be right there for you, right? And we do that for like ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And then kind of slowly over time, in ways we don't really even notice, the child is getting a little more quote unquote independent,
Mm,
or it's okay for that child to fuss just a little bit longer while I finish putting this load of laundry in. Whereas when they were 2 months old, I would have like dropped what I was doing and run right to them. But I kind of intuitively know that my 14-month-old is okay to fuss for a little bit while I finish this chore. And I'm like, hey, baby, I'll be right there. Mama's coming, right?
mm-hmm,
And so some of it is truly just kind of intuition and gut, that
mm,
as you know a child long enough and you've done the co-regulation and you've provided the felt safety, that you have an intuitive sense of when is it time to start raising the bar. The other thing is to remember that just because I've created an environment that I think is safe doesn't mean the child's experiencing it that way.
mm-hmm,
You know, that felt safety is a um, personal experience and a subjective experience. And just because a situation is safe doesn't mean that that person is feeling safe.
mm-hmm,
So that's an important thing to always remember. And then I also frequently tell people who's trying to give their kids more independence, or trying to give them more responsibility, or just trying to parent them a little bit more like their same age peers, but the excuse me, but the kids are kind of cratering
mm,
in various different ways. What I'll often say is it feels as though you really want your kid to be able to rise to this level of like responsibility and be closer to their same age peers, but I feel like your kid is telling us like very loud and clear that they just can't,
mm,
that they still need so much more co-regulation. You know, like if I believe that kids do well when they can, and this kid isn't doing well, there's a really good reason for that. um and a lot of that's knowing our own like way we swing on the pendulum. Like, do we tend to be more nurture, or do we tend to be more structure? If we're somebody who leans more towards structure, I probably don't have to worry about accidentally giving a kid too much nurture,
mm-hmm,
because I'm going to kind of lean that way anyway.
mm-hmm,
If I'm kind of the opposite way, I want to be aware of that. Like, oh, I tend to be more on this nurture side. I've got to be really aware that I'm looking for cues for when this kid is ready to, you know, have the bar raised, or tolerate more discomfort, or be more stressed, you know, because we don't learn that we can Like stress resiliency is grown through being stressed.
Mm-hmm.
It just has to be a sweet spot of stress, right? We can't blow people's stress systems out of the water. Then they just get hurt,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have to, it's like training. The metaphor I'll often use is like, it's like training for a marathon, right? Like we have to incrementally increase the stress in a way that it's tolerated. If we increase it too much, we're going to end up going back to square one. That just takes a lot of intuition and a lot of attunement. And really the best way to do that is to be really regulated yourself as the adult. So we just go back to that.
And like a willingness to be uncomfortable. I know there was quite a few times that I
Mm-hmm.
set an example for parents that would engage in a lot of negotiations with their kids. Like they would set a boundary and then it would be like 5 more minutes and then they're like 3 and then the kid's like and then like it's like this and you're just like, you said 5, like 5 is a pretty good, like have it be done. And when it's 5 and like for them, the visible discomfort of setting a limit and when their kid like is really throwing a fit now because we're actually the physical discomfort of like, I'm like, we're ignoring, like we're looking away, our body language is going to be somewhere else, like he's throwing things now because he's upset that you're not engaging with him, and now and they want to just engage and be like, the reason why you're not getting it right now, like, and give him rationale and all this, and it's like, no, stop. It's really difficult sometimes to just like, you don't like, this is you sending a boundary, this is you being as steady as a fence post, which is really another way of being nurturing.
Absolutely.
Your kid knows exactly what they can expect.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've noticed that as well, as like, it takes a lot of discomfort in what feels like almost being not a good parent, because you're not addressing what seems to be a need in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of human nature want to just alleviate people's discomfort where what's really needed. And sometimes that's totally needed. Sometimes what our kids need is for us to say like, whoa, that boundary was too high. And I made a mistake and I'm really lowering my expectation of you right now. But sometimes what all of us need is somebody to just be with us while we're really unhappy or really uncomfortable or really angry about something. Like my kid has every right to be mad that he's not getting as much video game time as he wants, right? Like, yeah, you can be mad about that. That's totally fair that you're mad about that. Doesn't mean you're going to get more. You should be mad, and I'm not going to judge you for being mad or be mad that you're mad or tell you should be grateful that you even got any screen time at all, right? Like you get to be mad.
Right, you get to be mad, and you get to rely on like, I have your best interest, I'm going to follow through with what I say, and I'm going to give you space to have those emotions. I love that. I love it. Okay. I ask everybody that comes on this, but what are your ideas if I were to say like, how do we end this foster care crisis? Because more and more kids are coming into care. I know it's a big loaded question, but what are your thoughts?
Actually, what I think we need to do is our entire society and our entire culture needs to be move towards a human informed lens in the way we understand people's behaviors, in the way we take care of people in our country and our culture, in a way that we support families who are hurting, in a way that we, look at the disproportionality of kids coming into foster care, in a way that we look at how we have kids come into foster care because the people taking them into care sometimes simply have different values about how kids should be raised. And that's not to, undervalue the reality that some kids are very, very, very hurt in their homes and need to be taken into a safer place. But there's also, I've done a lot of child welfare work, and I also know that sometimes safe is subjective, and sometimes we bring kids into care and then we don't do what we need to do to support their families to help them go home.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we can refocus our cultural beliefs and expectations, frankly, around people who are hurting, people who have mental illness, people who have substance abuse problems, people who, live in poverty, and rallied around them as a community, I think we'd be looking at a real different situation with foster care right now.
Absolutely, yeah. And through a lot of the people I've asked, it has come down to more supports. I didn't even realize how few supports there are for biological parents. It's kind of like, here's a case plan to get your kid back, and it's like,
right.
cool.
Good
Well,
luck.
I don't have many of the tools to be able to do that, or even like very like access to care or transportation or.
Well, exactly. Again, that's a very kind of privileged way, right? Like the people who are holding the privilege are the ones making the rules for what is supposed to be done, when some of these families truly don't have enough money to put gas in their car, and they don't have access to public transit. Like there's very real practical barriers that people in place of privilege don't really have any connection or awareness of. And we shouldn't be taking kids away from their families because of access to resources.
Yeah, and there's a huge stigma, once once you have your kids taken away, like there's a whole bunch of judgment from the community that goes with that. The community will more be like, and she lost her kids, rather than like, oh my gosh, we've got to help her get her kids back.
Exactly. How do we rally around you? How do we support you? How do we deal with the fact that our judgment is actually all of our own fear of how easy it is to lose your kids to the government? And so when I'm in a place of fear, I move into judgment as opposed to compassion. Like how much is a person struggling in their life to have come to the point where they've lost their kids to the government? That person needs love, care, and compassion, and boundaries and expectations, and absolutely the same things, but in a compassionate, provided in a compassionate way. That's hard.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we're moving in that direction. I started the podcast just to start the conversation, because I feel like people should be talking about it. And if, one more person can listen and hear these points of view, and maybe hear from a bio mom that lost her kid, or maybe hear from how it feels to be adopted out of care and judged in that way, or that maybe we will start to break down some of those walls that we have up, or some of those just assumptions that we've made.
Yeah, I hope so.
So I know that you do offer yourself as a speaker or keynote. And so where can people find you, and how can they connect with you?
The easiest way to find me is just on my website, which is my last name, Gobbel, Gobbel, counseling.com. For now, I'm in the middle of kind of rebranding, but that should work for a long time still. And so all the information about, accessing me as a consultant or a trainer or a speaker is all there.
Do you have any social accounts?
You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, and I have a blog too.
Okay. I will link those in the show notes.
Great. Thanks.
And thank you so much for coming on. It's been enlightening, I know, so much for me. And I think that you have not only a great message for parents, but for everybody that works in this space. So thank you so much. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Well, and thank you for the work you're doing too. As well, I know about the effort to, go into producing this, and a labor of love to get, more information out to more people. So thank you.
Thanks. Have a great rest of your week.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.